As you said, my name is Kellam Throgmorton. I'm a graduate student at SUNY Binghamton out in New York. There we go. So, last weekend, I went into Chacoan Canyon to pull some of my thoughts together for this talk. And while I was there, I started thumbing through John Ware's new book, A Pueblo's Social History. And I kept looking over at my notes and looking at his book, and I'm kind of going, ah, crap, kind of covered a bunch of this. So I tore up my first draft, and I thought, what am I going to do? I'm trying to tie together how do you get from early villages occupied in the 8th and 9th century to Chacoan communities in the 9th and 10th century. So I said, well, I'm in Chaco. I went over to Pueblo Bonito, went into the West Plaza, sat down on one of those wooden benches, and sort of stared off in the direction of Old Bonito there, looking at room 33 for a little inspiration, and this is what I came up with. So what I want to do today is complicate the discussion on early Pueblo kinship and socio-political organization by making a few observations on what I've been calling longhouses for the past couple of months. So by longhouse, I mean those long, narrow, apartment-style complexes that are occupied beginning about AD 760 in the Central Mesa Verde region. I like the term longhouse because it implies its negation, which is the short house, and it also sets up a really nice dichotomy of longhouse, short house, which foreshadows great house, small house later in the Chacoan era. And also, it might have been because I was buried up to my eyeballs in a snowdrift in upstate New York most of the winter, where, of course, there are the more typically known longhouses in the northeast and southeastern Canada. So, in a nutshell, John Ware's hypothesis on these kinds of structures was that longhouses were matrilocal matrilineages. And that one of the key things that happened in the transition from Basket Maker 3 to Pueblo 1 is that you see the formalization of these lineages into endogamous villages. Over time, ranking between these lineages developed as younger branches split off and formed their own dwellings and built their own longhouses. And so by the time you get to the late Pueblo 1 period, you begin to see major differences between lineages, as evidenced by large masonry, U-shaped room blocks like McPhee Pueblo. I think it's trotted out as a good example of that. And that's often considered a proto-great house by a lot of archaeologists. Now, I think this is a pretty good scenario, and there certainly is a lot of cross-cultural support for the formation of villages under these circumstances due to some of the peculiarities of reckoning matrilineal descent, and the way that post-marital residence rules are practiced as well in matrilocal societies. But at the same time, I don't think that the process was ever completely realized, at least not at this time and not in this place in the northern Southwest. I think there's a lot of architectural evidence that suggests that there's great diversity in household organization and structure during this time period, which is basically late Basket Maker 3 and early Pueblo 1. For example, Sage Hill and Dos Casas phase structures, they coexisted for about 40 years between 760 and 800. So a Sage Hill style structure was defined by the DAP, and it's where the household is really focused in the pit structure. There's very little evidence for surface habitation rooms, and there are discontinuous, unconnected surface storage structures. The Dos Casas phase houses generally have several contiguous surface habitation rooms for every pit structure, and they're grouped together into these contiguous surface room blocks that include attached storage buildings. So I think that shows that there probably are at least two kinds of households going on at any one moment in this region up here. I looked at a comparative sample of about 12 villages that were occupied between 760 and 900. This also shows some support for the idea of there being multiple kinds of households at the same time in the Southwest. About half of the villages I looked at have somewhere between 2 and 5 longhouses. One of them is almost always over 100 meters in length. Several of the others are going to be between 40 and 60 meters in length. Now, the other half of the villages I looked at have that similar pattern, but in addition to that, they've got these short houses that are basically small habitations that are, the surface architecture is under 20 meters in length. When you start breaking it down by total room block length, up to 45% of the entire village is actually found within these short houses. So what this shows is that a significant number of people never moved into some sort of matrilineal, matrilocal communal dwelling or longhouse. And we also have to keep in mind that more than half of the people in the entire Central Mesa Verde region never actually moved into villages. They continued to live in dispersed basket maker 3-style communities. There's also some demographic evidence for the idea of multiple kinds of households. Computer simulations that look at changes in fertility rate, they show that changes in fertility can create inequalities in the distribution of kin. So during periods of increased fertility, like are hypothesized for the Neolithic demographic transition that people say occurred in this area during Basket Maker 3, that is the 7th to 8th centuries. During a period like that, you get increases in the proportion of the population that have extended kin. So that's like your cousins, your second cousins, groups like that. But if that fertility is not sustained, after about 100 or 150 years, the proportion of people in the population who don't really have these larger extended kin networks begins to rise again. So you end up with a situation where you get some households that are part of very large extended kin networks, and many others, most, they're actually have very small kin networks or none at all. Now, if we scale this to the basket maker colonization of the Mesa Verde region, and we'll just say that that happened somewhere between about 600 and 650 AD, it would suggest that 150 years later we're going to get these major inequalities in kin distribution. So somewhere around 750 to 800 AD, which is precisely when these longhouses appear, around 760. This seems especially true when we look at that little gap in the tree ring dates between Basket Maker 3 and Pueblo 1, which may suggest the population was slowing, people are recycling wood, and not actually, there's no like net gain in the number of houses that are being constructed. So what I think this shows is that first, villages are not the wholesale appearance of a matrilineal, matrilocal social organization, but it actually signifies developing inequalities in kin distribution and household organization. So these are not the material inequalities of the Chacoan era, but what it is a social transformation within early villages that creates these fault lines along which later inequalities can arise. So how do we get from long houses to short houses? If we get from long houses and short houses to great houses and small houses, I think if we look at the actual materiality of long houses, we can get a sense of this. Household size is typically between 2 to 12 individuals, but longhouse rooms are far more consistent than this would suggest. There's not a lot of variation there. They're like idealized, archetyped versions of the house. It's really hard to remodel these things when they're attached to your neighbors on either side of you, and they have a rigidity and formality that is lacking in the smaller houses. So I think that the longhouse served as a kind of technology of discipline that molded and formed the groups that were living in them, guiding their daily and ritual practices, and configuring their social and economic worlds, and ultimately creating these unequal power relations. Over time, these short house and long house dwellers became separate groups of people, as is evident at places like McPhee. And this foreshadows the great house, small house dichotomy. So if we turn towards the San Juan Basin now, and we look at the great house, small house pattern that's prevalent in the 10th century communities there, we see that it happens both inside and outside Chaco Canyon, which suggests that there are like stronger and deeper lying forces at work. It's more than just the order of arrival within the canyon or agricultural strategies that are driving this dichotomy. And I think it highlights how movement into the longhouse in the 8th and 9th centuries really led to the creation of new identities, nascent inequalities, and new cultural doxa that was not Chacoan, but which created conditions under which Chaco was possible. So moving forward, we can ask a couple of questions such as, where did longhouses go? Even at the end of the 9th century, there were plenty of big dwellings, big long houses that were not U-shaped masonry buildings like McPhee that we call proto-great houses. So where did those other structures like Grass Mesa end up going? Did this style disappear, or did it linger into the formative decades of the 10th century? I think some of these answers are going to require focused research on early Bonito phase communities. And there's a quote I really like from Severn Fowles' recent book that gives some guidance on where to go. The question of power lies in precisely how the world is gathered together. It lies in particular relations that are established, and it lies in exactly how people and things are to be balanced. So I think understanding power in Chacoan society is going to involve understanding how these communities were formed from groups and individuals, the nature of their relations with people, objects, and landscapes, and recognizing the contribution that longhouses and short houses made and how they were an important part of understanding how people and things were balanced in ancient Pueblo society.